Demolition at Starbase's Pad 1 is continuing at full speed while SpaceX hit a major milestone with Starship in Florida, the rollout and installation of the massive launch mount that will host launches from the Space Coast next year. The final work is ongoing at Starbase Pad 2 as teams continue to perform testing as they prepare for the installation of the tower's umbilical arm. We've also seen Raptors tested and spotted left, right and centre at SpaceX's McGregor test facilities. And we've nearly got a fully stacked next-gen ship, but somehow there are more test tanks? What's going on? I guess we'll find out in your Starbase update. Here at NSF, we've been keeping an eye on the Pad 1 demolition work recently, and as of late this demolition work has been ramping up significantly over the past week, with the removal of a large portion of Pad 1's launch mount. The entire top of the shielding that protected the walkway around the launch ring has been removed, and as of the time of writing this video, SpaceX has started to remove sections of the launch ring itself. The booster quick disconnect assembly has also been completely removed over the past week. It was initially cut into smaller, easy to remove sections and then dismantled piece by piece. The majority of the major external piping on the OLM has also now been removed. Once the entire top of the launch ring itself has been removed, we should expect to see all the hardware sitting inside of it completely removed, and then eventually the whole bottom of the launch ring and the walkway shielding completely removed also, until the only thing left remaining are the OLM legs, which may end up being a point that SpaceX has reached by the time of our next Starbase update. This demolition work did not occur without incident, however. On at least one occasion there appeared to have been a fire inside the launch mount, which was fortunately extinguished quickly. It is rather ironic that this launch pad supported 11 launches of the world's most powerful rocket, yet it was its demolition that caused a fire and not the launches themselves. While all of this work has been taking place on the mount, the retention ponds to the south have been filled in with soil, likely from all the work carried out to remove the tank farm berm. The water deluge plate has also been covered with soil and debris from the launch mount demolition, and it would not be surprising if they start removing it within the next few weeks. Now, all of this demolition work is not because Pad 1 is going to be gone forever. As we have said many times in previous episodes, this work is necessary in order to construct a far more advanced pad with updated designs. The same can be said for the launch tower, and no, the tower itself is not being removed. However, there are numerous outdated systems within the tower that would greatly benefit from upgrades, including, for example, the base of the tower. The rear section at the base of the tower, for example, contains the drawworks that allow the chopsticks to move up and down the tower. For Tower 2, this area is better reinforced, so Tower 1's old drawworks housing has been removed to make way for an improved version. The drawworks itself was actually removed and sent out of Starbase, likely for refurbishment and storage until Tower 1's base is ready to receive it once again. Teams have also set up new lines hanging from the top of the tower for what appears to be maintenance platforms that will be able to travel up and down the four columns of the tower. These will likely be part of a major maintenance and upgrade effort on the rails and steel structure of the tower as SpaceX prepares Pad 1 for its next phase. In the last few days, we've also seen further removal of the damping system used on the chopsticks landing rails during vehicle catches. Once again, this is another one of those demolition steps necessary to allow for upgrades to take place. And on that same note, the same can be said about all the tank farm hardware that was removed from the tank farm this week. More subcoolers and pipes have been stripped down from the Pad 1 side of the tank farm. These subcoolers were then sent out of Starbase, and at least 6 of them have arrived at SpaceX's McGregor test site not long after. We're not sure what they'll be used for just yet, but I expect we'll find out in due course. While Starbase Pad 1's launch mount is being demolished over on the Florida Space Coast, another Starship launch pad has received its brand new launch mount. I'm referring, of course, to Launch Complex 39A. Last Tuesday, the 4th of November, SpaceX rolled out the Starship launch mount for LC-39A from the Roberts Road operations area all the way to the pad. The multi-hour roll began at around 9 o'clock in the morning Eastern Time and took just over 4 hours to reach the launch pad. If you recall, we mentioned in last week's episode that the giant LR-13,000 crane had already been raised and prepared for the lift and was awaiting the launch mount. That very morning, on the 4th of November, we saw the crane perform a series of movements that appeared to rehearse the lift process. The following day, on the 5th, the launch mount was lifted and installed on the pad, following a very similar procedure, so that earlier activity may well have been a rehearsal for the lift. Although a single crane was used rather than a tandem lift like for Starbase's Pad 2, it was still quite the complex operation. the mount had to be lifted up and over the service structure and also rotated during the process to align it correctly with its support legs on the flame trench. Even one of the chopstick arms had to be moved out of the way beforehand to allow for enough room for this maneuver. Now, I'm sure some of you might be wondering where this puts LC-39A in terms of its readiness timeline. Well, compared to Starbase's Pad 2, this launch mount roll and installation took place just under 6 months ago in May. However, when that launch mount was rolled out, it was far less complete than the one we've seen this week at 39A. For example, all 4 manifolds for the top deck's deluge system were already installed on the 39A launch mount. It also had the mounting brackets for the 2 booster quick disconnects, which we normally refer to as BQDs, already welded to the top deck. Additionally, the lower hood of the booster quick disconnects that will be used primarily for methane was also pre-installed on 39A's mount. On the other hand though, by the time SpaceX rolled Pad 2's launch mount, the pad's tank farm was nearly complete and was just awaiting connection to the tower and launch mount systems. But at 39A, there's still a considerable amount of work remaining to complete the Starship propellant and deluge tank farms. In recent days, we've seen the arrival of more tank farm hardware, including the delivery of a vertical tank. We also had a major delivery of water deluge tanks arriving by barge at the Kennedy Space Center turn basin. These 4 deluge tanks will be joining the 3 others that had already been delivered and installed at 39A. These steps certainly go a long way towards getting the launch site closer to activation, but only time will tell when that might actually happen. SpaceX hopes to begin launches of Starship from Florida next year, and with roughly a 6-month difference relative to Pad 2, that may not be entirely unrealistic. When do you think 39A will host its first Starship launch? Spring 2026? Maybe summer or autumn of 2026? Or will they take the entire year and won't launch until 2027? I sure hope it's not the latter, but let us know what you think in the comments. Of course, if we're comparing 39A to Pad 2 at Starbase, it makes sense to check the latest progress at that site. Over the last several weeks, most of the work has involved putting the finishing touches on various areas of the pad while also testing systems. One area receiving these final touches is the launch mount service structure. As we've highlighted in recent episodes, this structure is being clad in thick steel to protect it from the forces of launch. However, it cannot be fully clad or else no one could get in or out, so the solution is to install massive blast doors that allow access to the structure while protecting it during launches. That is exactly what they did to one of the entrances this week. The design of this door looks similar to what you'd find on a bank vault, with a rather thick steel door securing the entrance. Soon, the other entrance should receive a similar door, so we'll be keeping an eye on that. In recent days, teams have also installed more shielding on the sides of the service structure at the interface with the launch mount and the flame trench walls. On top of that, they've added even more cowbell covers on the various purging and ventilation vents present on this service structure. I don't know about you, but this launch pad could certainly do with a bit more cowbell. Now, while all of that has been ongoing with the service structure, there's been a great deal of work on the launch mount itself. Earlier in the week, we observed what appeared to be purging of the mount's water-cooled top deck. Although no water was pushed through the system, gas was indeed injected through the deluge system to clear out all the dust and other debris that had accumulated in the lines and on the deck itself during construction. This is a common practice before actual water is sent through the system. While we have seen tests of the water deluge system on the flame bucket and ridge cap down at the flame trench, something repeated once again this week, it may still be some time before we see the same for the top deck. That is because other far more important parts of the mount are being tested in the meantime. On the 6th of November, SpaceX rolled out a rather intriguing piece of hardware to the launch site. The piece had SpaceX development test written on it, and below that, Be Proofin. Now, SpaceX, considering your professional naming conventions require a serious amount of work, somehow you've always managed to knock it out of the park with the joke names. I don't know how you do it. We'd actually seen parts of this contraption some time ago and had thought at the time that it might be some sort of breakover fixture to bring ships and boosters down horizontal before being sent to Florida. But as is often the case with these theories, they were wrong, and this one was nowhere near that purpose. As soon as it was rolled out to the launch site and we saw it staged near Pad 2, it became much clearer what it was: an adapter that will be used to test the hold-down arm's ability to bear the weight of a fully fueled Starship rocket. You might not remember this, as it happened all the way back in January 2023, but a very similar load test was performed on Pad 1's launch mount. At the time, this was done with a more rudimentary setup. It had the loading jig adapter, which would connect to 2 of the mount's hold-down arms at once, and beneath it there were several stacks of counterweights simulating the equivalent weight that the 2 hold-down arms would need to support from a fully fueled Starship rocket, plus a little bit of wiggle room. A crane would then lift the contraption and relocate it onto another pair of hold-down arms until all 20 arms were load tested with this system. When this was done, SpaceX had already conducted testing on the pad with partial propellant loads on the full-stack Starship, but it was preparing to perform the first full wet dress rehearsal, so it needed to ensure the arms would support the full weight of the rocket before that major test. Given the flame trench beneath Pad 2's mount, the whole process may look a little bit different this time around, and it also seems that more than 2 arms are going to be tested simultaneously, so hopefully this process won't take as long. So yes, SpaceX are definitely proofing. In the last week, we've also seen more high-speed retraction tests of both booster quick disconnects on Pad 2, although for now they're not being done simultaneously. We've also noticed some sort of frames welded to the front and top of the BQD hoods, which we really have no idea what they might be for, but these could just be some sort of temporary hardware. In the last few weeks, we've also seen slow but steady progress on the launch tower's ship quick disconnect arm destined for Pad 2. At the Sanchez lot, the QD arm has received a great deal of attention lately, having already had much of the pipework fitted to the back of the arm, which should connect directly to the launch tower. Given this, it may be nearly ready for installation. We've also seen the arrival of heavy lifting equipment in recent days that might be what SpaceX will use to lift and install the ship quick disconnect arm on the launch tower. The SpaceX LR11000 crane at the launch site has also been reactivated and made operational once again, so that too could be preparing for an installation soon. Hopefully, not too long from now, we'll see the rollout closures for the arm to move from Sanchez to the launch site. We're definitely not going to miss that. This week, there was also further testing of the Pad 2 side of the tank farm, in this case the side that supplies liquid oxygen out to the launch tower and therefore to the ship. At the launch site, there is of course other types of construction underway, and over the last few weeks, it appears SpaceX has resumed drilling pilings for the air separation unit across the road. It's still unclear what the full facility will look like, but it is certainly taking some time just to prepare the ground for construction. Not that it's particularly surprising, given it's right next to the beach. Oh, and for some reason, SpaceX thought it would be a great idea to plant a few trees next to the wall of the launch site. I'm not sure that's a safe place for those trees, but I'll leave time to be the judge of that. Of course, it's not just the launch site undergoing construction. Starbase is also getting its own Giga Bay, and this week saw even more progress on that. In fact, we ended last week's episode discussing this construction and mentioned that 3 of the 4 tower cranes in the area had already become operational, with parts for the 4th having arrived at Starbase. Well, since then, that 4th tower crane has been fully assembled and is now operational. That means all 4 tower cranes are up and running and should be able to assist with the construction of the Giga Bay. The Giga Bay itself has received a great deal more beams and columns over the past few days, with the majority of these being placed on the side closer to the Star Factory and the central dividing wall. I'm pretty sure though you're more interested in when the next flight may be, and well, we might have at least some sort of an answer from SpaceX. This week, SpaceX's Vice President of Launch, Kiko Donchev, participated in the Economist Space Summit held in Orlando. Jeff Faust, a reporter for SpaceNews.com, was present at the summit and was posting live updates on social media. This included a comment from Kiko, who said that the very first version 3 Starship launch could take place as early as January. That sounds a bit ambitious, but we all know how SpaceX timelines tend to go, right? So this might be more of an aspirational target. Apparently, based on Jeff's reporting, he also mentioned that a booster would be rolling out to the pad for tests within, and I quote, days to weeks. That is a bit confusing, since we normally expect vehicles to go first out to Massey's for proof testing, and only then would they receive engines and proceed to the pad. However, in theory, SpaceX could try getting Booster 18 out to the pad for some fit checks, perhaps conducting ambient proof testing where they just load gas into the tank instead of liquids and the like. The testing at Massey's is no small matter, as it's not just about loading the vehicle with cryogenics, but also including thrust simulation testing. The test stand where it is positioned has rods that literally ram against the bottom of the booster to simulate the forces of the engines. I would say that is a really important test to carry out on the very first version 3 booster, especially considering it will be carrying a new generation of Raptor engines and that the entire aft end of the vehicle has been completely redesigned. So where are we at with the vehicles then if launch could be in under 3 months? Well, this week, Ship 39, the first version 3 ship, was further stacked in Mega Bay 2. It received the aft 3 barrel section, which forms the middle part of the liquid oxygen tank of the ship and should be the final section before the engine bay. Because of this, SpaceX moved the new transfer tube installation jig out of the Star Factory and eventually lowered Ship 39 over it so that all 4 pipes could be installed. Although, there are actually 5 pipes installed. The 5th one was added once the jig was in Mega Bay 2 and is part of the liquid oxygen header tank transfer line. This line runs all the way from the header tank at the tip of the nose cone down the side of the ship through the methane and liquid oxygen tanks before connecting to the engines at the base. The really interesting bit happened as soon as Ship 39 left the welding turntable at the rear right of Mega Bay 2. Some time ago, SpaceX had begun assembling a new test tank, S39.1, intended to test the redesigned aft section of the ship where the engines are attached and such. However, for some reason, this test tank only had its top 3 sections welded together, which simulate the rest of the ship, but the actual ship aft section was still missing. In fact, S39.1 was moved into the Star Factory a few weeks ago to make room for Ship 39 stacking inside Mega Bay 2, as it still lacked its aft section. And, you know, it's quite significant if they were to complete Ship 39 stacking, including its aft section, without having tested that new design first using this test tank. But with Ship 39 off the turntable, SpaceX took the opportunity to roll S39.1 once again, and this time it was joined in Mega Bay 2 by its own aft section. This redesigned section shows some noticeable changes to the quick disconnect assembly, as one would expect, given the new ship design and the fact this is meant to be the interface for on-orbit refueling. The aft dome itself also has been lowered slightly to increase the volume of the liquid oxygen tank, confirming the theory that the Raptor vacuum engines would be recessed into this tank to provide additional propellant capacity. After the welding of S39.1 was completed, the test tank returned to the Star Factory, likely to be outfitted with the necessary hardware for its forthcoming test campaign at the Massey outpost. Meanwhile, Ship 39 was lifted out of the transfer tube installation jig and placed on the Mega Bay 2 central work stand as it awaits its own aft section to be ready. If one were to hazard a guess, this might depend on S39.1's testing, so all eyes will be soon focused on the Massey outpost. Out at Massey's, work continues on preparing the static fire stand which was damaged during Ship 36's explosion 5 months ago. This past week, the static fire stand received the ship's quick disconnect plate that will interface with the new version 3 ships, and it's definitely quite different from the one for version 2. We can also see some more pipe work has been connected from the tank farm out to the service structure where the quick disconnect has been installed. While still nowhere near ready to support static fire testing, it's certainly getting closer given all this hardware that's now coming together. At Massey's, there are other test tanks in play as well, with Booster 18.1 and Booster 18.3 still there. While we had thought that Booster 18.1 may have been forgotten and left alone ever since it had that rather violent cryogenic proof test a couple of months ago, it has actually received some attention lately. If you remember, this test tank is meant to test the aft end of the next generation booster, including parts of the transfer tube which runs down the middle. In the last few weeks, teams have installed reinforcements on the sockets used for the diagonal pistons that push that internal transfer tube, so perhaps it may still have some life left and we might see more testing at some point. Booster 18.3 has also seen more attention and continues to be worked on inside, although, as we said last week, it's rather difficult to guess exactly what they're doing. Now, as for Booster 18, we assume that by now it has been fully stacked. You may recall that last week we mentioned that both the methane and oxygen tanks have been completely welded separately on each of the Mega Bay 1 turntables. A full stack of Booster 18 was very much expected to have happened by now, given the usual time it takes for this process. However, it is quite difficult to be certain as the door of Mega Bay 1 is kept closed most of the time. Even when it is open, it's not that easy to check. The 2 tanks of the booster are welded on the welding turntables located at the front corners of the bay. Normally, SpaceX begins with the liquid oxygen tank on the right front corner, and once that is completed, it is then moved to the left front corner. Then, the methane tank is welded on the front right corner, and is then subsequently brought to the left front corner for stacking on the oxygen tank. This left front corner is really hard to see as it requires a vantage point from the north of the production site, which is basically out there in the flats, an area not exactly easily accessible. The closest one can get is by looking through our camera on the roof of the Margaritaville Beach Resort, South Padre Island, but the distance somewhat renders looking for the booster a little bit impossible. Assuming it is fully stacked, we should next see the delivery of its pressure lines and raceways, which are necessary for the booster and its tanks to function. If we observe those going into Mega Bay 1, that will be our sign of progress moving forwards. Once all this hardware is installed, we may indeed see B18 proceeding to testing. Now whether that's at Massey's or at Pad 2, that is something we will eventually determine. In the meantime, SpaceX is making great progress inside the Star Factory, constructing the sections for the next ships and boosters. Starting with Ship 40's nose cone, since our last update, it has been freed from its scaffolding enclosure and relocated inside the nose cone hull. When we saw it being lifted during this operation, we thought it might be stacked onto its payload bay section, but at least as of the last time we've seen it, it remained on its own. Ship 41's nose cone, which is further back in the production line, is still enclosed in scaffolding and receiving its heat shield tiles. Given the progress observed, it would not be surprising if we begin to see the installation of its aerodynamic flap soon. Meanwhile, Ship 42's nose cone is still awaiting the installation of its thermal protection system, and Ship 43's nose cone is also awaiting further progress since our last update. One interesting detail is that while the S39.1 test tank was passing through the large Star Factory door, we were able to see Ship 43's common dome section, which had to be moved at some point to make space at the entrance of the facility. Of course, it is just 3 rings stacked together and there is no dome installed yet, but there is a very useful label on it indicating it is Ship 43's common dome barrel. As for Ship 45's nose cone, there have been no visible changes since last week. While Caesar was out there looking through the glass windows, he also spotted a booster aft section barrel very early in its production. We know it's that specific section because of the cutouts for the hold down clamps and the vents at the bottom of the engine section. At some point, that engine section will be fitted with engines, and of course, a good place to observe the progress is SpaceX's McGregor facility. Since our last update, SpaceX has conducted 28 Raptor tests at this site, with further relight tests taking place on both the Raptor North and Raptor South test stands. The first set on Raptor South took place on the 3rd of November, and began with a 100-second burn, followed by 2 tests, each lasting 20 seconds, and then a brief 1-second relight test immediately after. The second set at South occurred on the 4th, and started with a 100-second burn, followed by 4 tests, each lasting 20 seconds consecutively. As for the Raptor North stand, the first set took place on the 6th, with an 80-second burn, followed shortly afterwards by a relight and a 15-second burn. Then, on the 7th, there was a 140-second burn, followed by a relight and a 16-second burn. By the way, that 140-second test was in fact the longest performed so far on Raptor North, which is receiving progressively longer tests each week. Speaking of long-duration tests, there were also 4 lengthy burns on the Raptor South stand, 2 lasting 6 minutes each, and the other 2 closer to 5.5 minutes each. Such extended tests suggest these engines might be simulating a ship ascent profile, so hopefully these will be going on a ship soon. We have also observed continued testing of engines at the Raptor vertical stand, with durations of about 114 seconds, which, as we speculated last week, could be for acceptance testing of booster engines. This increase in test frequency is very promising, and it's even more encouraging when accompanied by a procession of engines being transported back and forth from the test stands. On the 4th, we spotted not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 Raptor engines being moved at once, leaving the test area. At least one of them appeared to be Raptor 3 serial number 54, making it the highest serial number spotted at least until later in the week. The day after those 4 were moved at McGregor, we saw the return of our friend Raptor SN30, which we had already seen back on the 24th of October, but this time it had Dev Only painted on its nozzle. It doesn't take a genius to guess that this is because it is a development engine. But that was not the only occasion we saw this engine. The following day, on the 6th, we once again spotted 4 engines being trucked around McGregor at once, and one of them was, yet again, SN30. This time, there was a new highest serial number, SN56, among the group of Raptors, although we couldn't make out the other numbers very clearly, so some could have been higher than that. And if that wasn't enough Raptors for the day, yet another 4 engines arrived at the test area at McGregor later on the 6th. This time, we could only clearly see the number for SN47, while the others only had the last digit visible. One of them had a number ending in 9, and while I'd like to believe this is SN69, it's probably still a bit too early for that, given most of these engines seem to be in the 50s range. Also, I can already imagine Elon would have posted about that on X because, well, you know why. It's quite clear that the pace is ramping up on all fronts, Starbase, Florida, and McGregor, but the main question remains whether all of this will be on track for a launch of Starship version 3 early in 2026, or if we'll have to wait closer to the middle of the year for that. I suppose time will tell, as always. But what do you think? Based on all the work, do you think a January 26 launch is possible, or is that a rather overly optimistic date? Let us know what you think in the comments. I've been Ryan Caton for NSF, thanks for watching, and goodbye.